Subconscious Power. Chapter 2, Subconscious Mentation. For many years, Western psychology held tenaciously to the theory that all there is of mind. All mental processes, all thought, all feeling, all will activity were contained within the narrow limits of the ordinary consciousness. It held that the ordinary consciousness was identical with mind. We say Western psychology because Oriental psychology for many centuries, for over 2,000 years in fact, had recognized the out of consciousness mental planes, states, and processes. In spite of the fact that the emotional nature undoubtedly has its fundamental and elemental existence below the levels of the ordinary consciousness, these old-time orthodox psychologists held firmly to their original contention and denounced those who ventured to express a doubt concerning it. These old-timers, it is true, found many facts which remained unexplainable under the old theory. But like many other orthodox thinkers along other lines of thought, they took the position that the old dogmas and teachings must be supported at all costs, and that if the facts conflicted with their theories, then so much for the worse for the facts. But finally, the pressure became too strong, and the younger men studying and thinking about the science of the mind began to advance tentatively the idea that perhaps there might be other regions of the mind, regions lying below the threshold of consciousness, levels or planes lying below the ordinary mental levels and planes upon which important mental processes are performed. In spite of the continued and strenuous opposition of the orthodox psychologists, these courageous thinkers conducted extended experiments and made careful observations for the purpose of discovering the nature and the laws of these great unexplored realms of the human mind. These investigations were made for the most part by psychologists who felt that this unknown region of the mind must exist in order to explain and satisfactorily account for certain observed conscious mental phenomena. The conscious effects were before them, but the out of consciousness cause of these were unknown. They reasoned that if such and such effects were present, then such and such causes must also be present, although so far these causes had not been discovered. These pioneers were like the astronomers who posited the necessary existence of certain undiscovered planets by reason of the discovered actions of certain known planets, which actions were seen necessarily to be caused by the presence and influence of other planets as yet undiscovered by science. Or, changing the illustration, we may say that these advanced thinkers were like the early explorers who, by reason of occasionally observing strange floating trees, animals, and bodies of men in certain far distant waters, hazarded the theory that there must be an undiscovered world situated far to the west of their own world. This was the idea that inspired Columbus, and which finally led to the discovery of America. In the same scientific spirit, these pioneer psychologists sought to account for certain observed mental activities, deflections, and influences upon the theory that there must exist other planes of mental activity lying out of consciousness, which constituted the field of a wonderful activity, the results of which afterward rose to the surface of consciousness. Leibniz, the great German philosopher, was one of the first of the leading Western psychologists to advance the theory that the mind is not limited to the narrow field of the ordinary consciousness, and that there are changes occurring, energies always at work, and modifications constantly taking place in the mind of which the ordinary consciousness is not aware. Others followed in his footsteps until finally the large number and high standing of the advocates of the new idea forced recognition and respect for it on the part of the orthodox psychologist. Vigorously opposed and often violently ridiculed, this great idea gradually attracted to itself strong support and finally became an accepted doctrine in the standard Western psychology. As a straw showing how the wind of even the most conservative thought is now blowing in the direction of the general recognition of the existence of the out of consciousness planes or levels of mental activity, we quote the following extract from the article contained in the Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, volume 25, page 1063. The reality of modes of mental operation, which may properly be called subconscious or subliminal, is now generally admitted. During the last quarter of the 19th and the opening years of the 20th century, there has been accumulated a mass of observations which suffices, in the opinion of many of these best qualified to judge, to establish the reality of processes which express themselves in purposeful actions and which bear all the marks from which we are accustomed to infer conscious recognition and volition, but of which nevertheless the subject of normal personality has no knowledge or awareness other than such as may be shared by any second person observing his actions. Perhaps the greatest cause of the objection of the old-time psychologists to the idea of the subconscious, and one of the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of the understanding of the subject by the average modern layman, is that of the seemingly contradictory notion of mental activities performed without consciousness. It is indeed hard to conceive of thinking without consciousness, but subconscious or even unconscious thinking is not really thinking without consciousness. It is rather thinking on planes of consciousness other than that of the ordinary consciousness. The term unconscious, so frequently applied to the activities of the subconscious, is particularly unfortunate. It serves to bewilder the student and to arouse uncalled for opposition in the minds of those unfamiliar with the real facts of the case. Subconscious is not unconscious. It is rather other consciousness. This is a most important distinction. We trust that you will fix it in your mind and observe it in your thought upon the subject. The Freudian school has given great prominence to the term the unconscious, which was originally employed by von Hartmann, in its consideration of certain important phases of the activities of the subconscious. This fact has served to add to the difficulties attached to the subject of the out-of-consciousness mental processes. But the Freudians do not intend to convey the idea that the unconscious is unknowing. On the contrary, they hold that it knows much and knows well. Dr. Wilfrid Ley, one of the closest exponents of the teachings of Freud, says on this point, the unconscious is not to be regarded as the unknowing part of the mind, but only as the unknown part. From one point of view, there is no such thing as the unknowing part of the mind, because the mind is essentially that part of the personality that is knowing with greater or less intensity, and knowing now one and now another object, but also knowing something from the first day of its life until the last. But the unconscious may be described as the generally unknown realms of the ego, into the seemingly bottomless abyss of which the sensations and perceptions of the individual are constantly sinking, and from which, no matter how hard we try, we cannot, without the help which analytic psychology offers us, recover anything except a very limited amount of visual, verbal, or other memories. A little further on in this section of the book, we shall show just why the subconscious is the generally unknown realms of the ego. Modern psychology is able to furnish the explanation, one that is quite satisfactory when rightly understood. But before proceeding to such explanation, we wish to clear away another quite frequent cause of misconception, misinterpretation, and misunderstanding of the character of the real nature of the subconscious, namely the erroneous dual mind theory, which to some extent has become attached to it by reason of the hasty generalizations of some of the earlier writers upon the subject. One of the great fallacies arising from the hasty generalization of some of the early investigators, teachers, and writers upon the subject of subconscious, and one which has been quite difficult to explain away to the popular mind, is that which is generally known as the two-mind theory, or the dual mind hypothesis. Arising from this is that an associated fallacy consisting of identifying one of the hypothetical two minds with the soul, instead of regarding both of these two respective fields of mentation as particular divisions, regions, levels, or planes of mental activity, all of which are instruments of the manifestation and expression of the ego, self, or I am I of the individual. Frederick W.H. Myers, the English essayist and investigator of psychic phenomena in 1987, the first to advance tentatively the idea of the dual mind of man. But Myers was far more conservative than were some of his followers in this respect, as well be seen from the following brief consideration of his ideas. Myers' original idea was that the self is not only a unity, but also a coordination of its several phases and powers. He held that in addition to the more commonly recognized attributes, the self possesses faculties and powers unexercised and unexercisable by the consciousness that finds employment in the direction of the affairs of everyday life. At first, Myers confined his attention to the conception of a level of consciousness existing below the ordinary level or plane of everyday consciousness, below the threshold of that consciousness, as he very aptly expressed it. He employed the term the subliminal subconscious to indicate all that takes place beneath the ordinary threshold, or say, if preferred, the ordinary margin of consciousness. Not only those faint stimulations, whose very faintness keeps them submerged, but much else which psychology as yet scarcely recognizes, sensations, thoughts, emotions, which may be strong, definite, and independent, but which by the original constitution of our being seldom merge into that supraliminal current of consciousness which we usually identify with ourselves. But later, Myers yielded to the temptation to generalize beyond conservative limits, and he thereby laid the foundations for much wild thought on the part of his later followers. Thought which, by the way, Myers would undoubtedly have repudiated had he been living at the time. But even his generalization was advanced quite modestly and tentatively, as will be seen by the following statement of it made by him at the time. Perceiving that there are not only isolated subliminal processes, but that there also is a continuous subliminal chain of memory involving just that kind of individual and persistent revival of old impressions and responses to new ones, which he commonly called a self, I find it permissible and convenient to speak of a subliminal self. The following explanation made by Myers shows that at the last, his term, the subliminal self, was employed principally for the purpose of convenience and for distinguishing between the two great planes of mental activity, rather than as a hard and fast declaration of belief in a two-mind or two-self combination of entities. I do not intend by using this term, the subliminal self, to assume there are two correlative and parallel selves existing always within each of us. Rather, I mean that part of the self which is commonly subliminal, and I conceive that there may be not only cooperations between these quasi-independent trains of thought, but also upheavals and alterations of personality of many kinds, so that what was once below the surface may for a time or permanently rise above it. And I conceive also that no self of which we can here have cognizance is in reality more than a fragment of a larger self, revealed in a fashion at once shifting and limited through an organism not so framed as to afford it full manifestation. Another phase of the dual mind theory became quite popular for a time as the result of the theories and teachings of Dr. Thompson J. Hudson, which were first announced in his book entitled The Law of Psychic Phenomena, published in the year 1893. Dr. Hudson's original fundamental theory was that man has or appears to have two minds, each endowed with separate and distinct attributes or powers, each capable under certain conditions of independent action. It should be closely understood at the outset that for the purpose of arriving at a conclusion, it is a matter of indifference whether we consider that man is endowed with two distinct minds, or that his one mind possesses certain attributes and powers under some conditions and certain other attributes and powers under other conditions. It is sufficient to know that everything happens just as though he were endowed with a dual mental organism. Under the rules of current reasoning, therefore, I have a right to assume that man has two minds, and the assumption is so stated in its broadest terms as the first proposition of my hypothesis. For convenience, I shall designate the one as the objective mind and the other as the subjective mind. But Hudson soon advanced from this comparatively modest fundamental premise. He proceeded as if the duality of the mind were an established fact, and he attributed to his hypothetical subjective mind the most wonderful powers and properties. In addition to the well-recognized subconscious mental processes, he attributed to the subjective mind certain mysterious powers which he held sufficient to account for the psychic phenomena of telepathy, hypnotism, clairvoyance, spiritistic manifestations, psychic action at a distance, psychic movement of material objects, etc. He held that the subjective mind acted without the use of the physical senses, that it was able to see at a distance and without the natural organs of vision, that it could leave the body and travel to distant lands, that it could read the thoughts of others and the contents of sealed envelopes and closed books, etc., etc. Finally, he announced, in other words, it is the soul. Hudson claimed that the subjective mind operated more freely and efficiently when the person is placed in the hypnotic state, and that it was unqualifiedly and constantly amenable to the power of suggestion. That is to say, the subjective mind accepts without hesitation or doubt every statement that is made it, no matter how absurd or incongruous or contrary to the objective experience of the individual. In his later books, Dr. Hudson sought to establish the immortality of the soul by means of his hypothesis of the subjective mind, the latter being by him identified with the soul. He also sought to establish the divine pedigree of man by means of the same hypothesis, holding practically that divine mind must be subjective mind raised to infinity, notwithstanding that he had previously asserted that the subjective mind could be hypnotized and that it did its best work while in that state, and that it was amenable to suggestion to such an extent that it would accept without hesitation the most absurd and ridiculous statements. Hudson's theories and teachings, though extremely popular for a time, are now but seldom heard of or quoted. Their value now is generally held to consist chiefly of the great interest which they aroused in the public mind concerning the phenomena of the subconscious. The extravagances of the theory and the wildness of many of its conclusions have been gradually ironed out by the more thoughtful and scientific treatment of the subject by the later investigators and writers. The value of Dr. Hudson's pioneer work is gratefully acknowledged by the present day workers along the same general lines, and much of his teaching, which was at one time severely condemned by the more conservative psychologists, is now seen to fit in with the newer reviews of the subject when the former is properly interpreted and rightly understood and stated. We do not consider it necessary to enter here into an extended recital of the theories and teachings of the multitude of teachers and writers who followed rapidly in the footsteps of Myers and of Hudson, and who carried to an extent undreamed of by these pioneers their original comparatively conservative hypotheses of the dual self or the dual mind. While serving to attract to the general idea of the subconscious, the minds of many persons who otherwise would never have heard of it, they often tended to repel the minds of more thoughtful persons by the mass of fantastic theory and unwarranted conclusions with which they surrounded the fundamental facts. All this, however, has now almost entirely passed away. The barnacles have been scraped from the bottom of the ship, and it is now quite easy sailing. We now hear very little of the dual mind or the dual self theories. The facts which were obscured or distorted by them are now explained and accounted for by the teachings of approved modern psychology. The unity of the mind is still maintained, but even the most conservative psychologists now admit, nay, actually insist, that the mental unity has many phases, many planes, levels, and regions of manifestation and expression. Science now says, in effect, If we are called upon to postulate a separate self or mind to account for and explain each of every phase or aspect of mental activity, we shall have not two, but 3, 4, 5, 7, 10, 20, or 100 different selves, minds, or entities on our list. The sane and logical conclusion is that the mind is unitary, one, having many phases, forms, modes, or aspects of manifestation and expression, and many levels or planes, regions, or realms of activity and process. Professor Joseph Jastrow says concerning this point, it is quite misleading to think of the subconscious as a veritable, independently organized psyche, or as a subservient understudy, however partially apposite and wholly legitimate such comparisons may be as metaphorical aids. The conscious and the subconscious, if we may clothe those aspects of our mental life in substantive form, are but two souls, but with a single thought, for the simple reason that they are but one soul, and the unity of the heartbeat is inherent in the organism that gives them life. It is only because the silent partner in our mental administration is only the sole head thereof in another guise, with another occupation, that his dominant habits, interests, endowments, experiences pervade their common business. It is again because the one contributes to the joint undertaking, so largely unheard and unseen, that those who have intercourse with this concern, as indeed the director thereof himself, have little occasion to come in contact with influence and data that do not appear on the books. Now let us return to the point of our consideration of the subconscious, wherein we proceed to investigate the subject of just why the contents of that great portion of the mind is unknown to the individual. You will remember that we have told you that modern psychology is able to furnish this explanation, and that we promised you that we would furnish you with it. Here is the explanation in a nutshell. You are aware only of such contents of your mind which are within the field of ordinary consciousness. You are conscious of only such of your mental states and processes which at the moment of ordinary consciousness are included in the radius of your conscious attention. Accordingly, the field of ordinary consciousness and the field of conscious attention are identical. And your conscious attention is directed to or held by a particular object or subject, then you are conscious of that object or subject. If your conscious attention is not so directed or held by that object or subject, then you are not conscious of it. A little self-examination will reveal to you the truth of the above statement. You will see at once that you are aware or conscious at this moment of only an infinitesimal portion of the entire contents of your mind, of what you know, of what you feel, of your beliefs, of your likes or dislikes, and so on. Your mind is filled with knowledge acquired by you in your past experience, with feelings of various kinds, which you have developed in like manner, with ideas, plans, designs, purposes, aims, ends, desires, longings, aspirations. You know that this is so, although at this present moment, these mental states are not in your field of consciousness. Your conscious attention is not directed to or held by them. The moment that you turn your conscious attention in the direction of any of these things, that moment do these things proceed to rise to the plane of ordinary consciousness, and you become aware of them. This is what happens when you think about things, when you indulge in reverie, when you start into motion the stream of memory and recollection. All this is a matter of ordinary everyday experience with you. Yet you may never have thought of it in just this way, nor realize the principle involved in the process. You see, there are two general kinds of knowing as follows. One, the knowing arising from the present consciousness of things, and two, the knowing which consists of the knowledge which you have salted down and stored away in your mind. And this in your mind really means in your subconscious. In the same way, there are two general kinds of feeling as follows. One, the feeling which is at this moment present in your conscious attention. And two, the feeling which you know quite well are present in your mind, although you are not at this moment aware of it. If you would contain a clear illustrative idea of the nature of the contents of the subconscious, you need but think of the contents of your memory, for memory is one of the great phases of your subconscious. You know quite well that there is a wealth of knowledge stored away in your memory, of which you are not at this moment conscious. You know equally well that when your attention is directed to certain subjects or objects, then your memory will raise to the plane of conscious attention at least a considerable portion of your knowledge concerning these subjects. Where were those memories? Where was this knowledge before they arose into consciousness in response to directed attention? Surely they existed somewhere, but where? They existed in the subconscious just as truly as they afterward existed in your consciousness. Do you see the point? The subconscious is the great ocean of your mind, while your consciousness is but the surface activities of it. Your attention brings to the surface such contents of your mental ocean as may be called for or drawn there by the appropriate causes. But the attention does not create them, it merely brings them to the surface. These contents of your mind are just as real, just as really items of your knowledge, while sunk in the depths of the subconscious, as when raised to the surface. To limit your mind to your conscious states, ignoring the far greater contents of your subconscious, would be just as absurd as to limit the ocean to its surface, ignoring the wonderful body of its depths. But not only are items of knowledge stored away in this great ocean of the subconscious, wonderful mental activities and processes are constantly underway in its hidden depths. The subconscious is not a dead sea. It is a great ocean of activity. It never rests. It never sleeps. It works while your ordinary surface consciousness is resting or sleeping. A great portion of your thinking is being performed there. In its realm, there are mental processes underway, the end of which is to solve your problem for you, to answer your question, to form your judgments, to work upon the materials which your conscious mentality is handed over to it instinctively. You see, your mental machine is a far more wonderful thing than you had imagined. It is something bigger than you have dreamed it to be. In the following sections of this book, we shall show you the kind of mental work the subconscious is doing for you, and the still better work it is capable of doing for you when you direct it rightly. For the present, we are merely striving to awaken you to a realization of its nature and of the facts of its existence. Nature, or the power underlying nature, has wisely committed the greater portion of your mental work to the subconscious. If your conscious mentality were required to attend to even but 1,000th part of the work of the subconscious, you would have no time whatsoever to attend to the tasks and problems of your everyday conscious life. In order to allow your conscious mentality to perform its rightful tasks, nature has handed over to the subconscious the greater portion of the entire mental activities, processes, and work. You will realize this more fully as you proceed with this instruction. Dr. Wilfred Lay says the unconscious operates in every aspect of our lives, not merely in the actions ordinarily known as unconscious or automatic, but in that part of our activity to which we attribute the most vivid consciousness. For in a certain sense, we are most helped or hindered by the unconscious part of ourselves when we think that we are most keenly alive. Our unconscious pervades our conduct in the most minute details, just as the air we breathe is forced by our blood through our tissues. And it might almost be said that it is as important and as great in extent when compared with the conscious present as the air, so small a part of which we breathe is in extent in proportion to the minute particles of it that we take into our lungs.